A lot of the applications that we build rely on stuff like email or SMS push notifications for notifying users when stuff happens. But not all users necessarily want to receive all of the different types of notifications that we can send them in our application. So it's very common to have something like this, where we have a little notification section where they can opt into the types of notifications that they want to receive. So that's what we're going to build today. Let's jump in. Now, before we build this or any feature really, we should take a bird's eye view, make sure that we understand exactly what it is that we are building here. So really, like in our simple application here, there's two types of emails that a user can receive, two types of transactional emails. And if you need a reminder, go check out my video with transactional emails with loops to understand what exactly I mean by transactional. But in short, transactional is just an email that is sent in the sort of the normal service of your application, right? It's not promotional. So we've got two types of transactional emails in this example. We've got an email that we're going to send to a user when a new task is created. You could imagine if this was a more sophisticated app, it's a new task in your team. For our purposes, it's just a new task. And a new email, an email that's sent to the user when a new task has been assigned to them, okay? Now, since it's just those two, I'm always in favor of keeping things as simple as possible, okay, right now. So really what we need from our application is a way to remember which of those email types or which of those notification types they have consented to receive, right? Which they have agreed to receive. So that's two separate pieces of data, really, two separate pieces of information that we need to remember, right? One for the new task being sent email and one for the new assignment email. So the simplest way, if we look at this database schema here, if this is our user in our database, right, we could really just do something like having a field that says notification, new task, which is a yes, no type field. And we could have basically the same one for when a new task is assigned to them, right? That would be like the most dead simple way to set this up. Now, even though this is dead simple and the quickest way to set this up, it's not necessarily setting ourselves up for success later on if our app evolves and morphs into something different. We want to set up our data structure so that it gives us the most powerful, flexible foundation that we can get from the get-go. That doesn't mean necessarily overcomplicating things, but we want to keep in mind a programming principle called separation of concerns, which basically says that let's keep objects or structures focused on doing one thing, really. So our user object, this is something that's going to be loaded every single time that the page loads. This data, all the data on that user object, as long as it's not protected by privacy rules, is going to be returned to the page when the page loads. And it's not all necessarily going to be relevant. And it's also not necessarily in the same kind of ballpark as like your stock standard important user identifying information that's used everywhere, right? I would classify these email notifications as their own cluster of information, right? Email preferences, right? User email preferences. So I would actually separate this out into a different data type. And that means that because it's separated out as a new data type, one, it's easy for us to keep a handle on the structure of our database, especially if we have outside collaborators come and work on it. But also, if we're going to add new notification types in the future, then or add new capabilities to the idea of the types of things that a user can be notified about, that's all nicely bundled and categorized in its own thing. We're not cluttering the concept of the user object, the user data type in our Bubble database. We've got a separate folder, if you will, right? A separate organizational entity that is in charge of handling or storing information relating to how the user wants to be notified about certain things, okay? So what I would actually do, I would actually create a new data type, and we'll call this notification preferences. And in here, I'm going to have, as you might expect, I'm going to have a relationship with the user. And in this handy little tool, I can represent that by by this syntax here. Okay, so our notification preferences are going to point back to the user. And then these guys that I had on the user, I'll actually just pop them into my notification preferences instead, right? And then on the user, I'll probably also want to point back to that notification preferences thing. And then in effect, I'll just call this a relationship. REL for relationship there, okay? So this is basically what our data structure looks like, right? We've got a notification preferences object that's entirely separate, that's storing the information about what types of things the user wants to be notified about, okay? And that data thing has a relationship with the user object. And in turn, of course, the user object is related to the notification preferences. And what this means is that we only need to kind of load in this notification preferences thing whenever we're asking the question, hey, are we allowed to send this type of thing to the user? It's not something that we're just going to have floating around on every page like the user object. Now, again, this is a pretty simple structure and one that I'm definitely happy with for the complexity of this feature right now. But just to draw a nice little bow around this, tie is the operative word, tie a nice little bow around this sort of discussion, there would be another way of kind of handling this where if we had something like ClickUp, where like we had potentially a very long list of notification types, okay? And notification types that are often changing, new items are being added, whatever. Then we might want to think about handling this in a more kind of malleable, flexible way. Right now, we've got basic UI set up for handling the types of things that users want to be notified about. But every time that we're going to add a new notification type, we basically have to create a new section manually, which isn't major, but then we have to set up the workflow for this individual thing separately. We'd have to, on our notification preferences, we'd have to add the new notification type. Let's say the notification type was new subscriber, for want of a better word. That would be a new thing that we would add. And so that we would have a data structure set up that's a little bit more flexible, I'd probably be in favor of, instead of having all those individual fields, I would have instead, let's just call it a notification, or a notification type rather. And then this notification type then becomes one of many stored on this notification preferences. Notifications, we'll call it a list. This is how it would look here, right? Where our notification preferences has a list of notifications, okay, that stores a list of notifications. So just to represent that in a slightly different way, we've got notification preferences, which is linked to the user. And then we've got notification types. Let me just make this slightly different color. And we might have sort of one of these for each type of thing, right? New task created, task assigned, new subscriber, right? And then the list of notification types on this notification preferences would in turn be storing all those notification types, okay? So that's how I would be thinking about it if there were a lot of different notifications. But for a lot of our apps, especially in the early stages, that's not necessarily the case. So I'm quite happy to have this not exist, not to overcomplicate it. And if we do enter a world in which we are going to expand our notification center, it should be fairly easy for me to restructure, refactor, as it's called, our database structure and the data that's already stored there to fit the new schema. But no sense in complicating things too early. In terms of our bubble database then, right, we know we need a new object, notification preferences, and we should make sure that that's private by default. Okay, that just means that the creator of that notification preference, the current user, is going to be able to see it. Doesn't need to be visible to anybody else. And then on here, we can have new task created as a yes/no field, and we can have new assignment as a yes/no field. And then for both of these, let's just say that by default, they're going to be set to yes, right? So when a new user signs up to our application, by default, we're going to send them these types of emails. But of course, as part of a good user experience, we should let them know that they can change their preferences should they wish. Okay. And then on the user object, we'll store the notification preferences as a relationship like this. Now, before we get into working on the UI here, we want to make sure that we're actually creating this data type so that we can use it ahead of time, right? So every user, when they sign up to our application, should have a notification preferences data type existing for them. Okay, you can think of this as an extension of the user object. My preferred way of doing this is to use a database trigger, which can be found here under backend workflows. Okay, and a database trigger is simply a workflow that runs when a certain type of change happens to the database. Okay, i.e., a new user has been created in the database. I don't mean a change to the database structure, like we're adding a new field here. A new entry or a new change to an object within the database. So that can include when new objects, new data objects are added. So I'm going to go and I'm going to add a new database trigger event for whenever a new user is created. And so we can call this new user. And this can essentially become like a catch-all workflow for us. If we have other things that we need to create when there's a new user signed up, we can do them within this workflow. We could also do them wherever your sign up logic is. So here for me, it's sign the user up. Okay. We could also add an action here to create a new thing and then create the notification preferences. However, I would think very carefully before you do that for a couple of reasons. One is that because the actions that you're adding here, they're happening on the page, right? In response to some trigger, usually from the user. And so they can slow down the perceived performance of the page, right? The user may have to wait for these actions to complete before they can progress. So as much as possible, we want the page to be going as fast as possible. So let's take stuff off the page and move it to the back end, move it to the server where it's going to happen in an asynchronous environment that's separate from what the user is actually perceiving on the screen. Okay. And then the second reason is just for organization, right? We want to be decoupling our logic as much as possible. We want to be keeping things, if we have, aside from the sign the user up, which has to happen here in the page logic, if we have all of this sort of backend admin stuff that we're doing whenever a new user is created, and we know that we're going to handle that as part of this database trigger, right? That's keeping our app very organized, right? That's keeping our logic nice and decoupled. And so in general is a very good practice, not just for yourself, but also if you're going to be collaborating with other people in the future. I'm going to have this new user trigger. And with any database trigger, we have to give it some constraint here. So we set the type of thing that we're going to be watching for, is essentially saying, hey, Bubble, watch for a change to that user's table, right? Watch for a change in this table here. And so we're telling Bubble we're going to watch for a change and then in the user's table. And then with this only when, we're going to say, what change are we going to watch for? Okay. And to do basically a response to a new object being created in the database, we want to say that the thing before the change, so in our case, the user before the change is empty, and the user now is not empty, okay? In some ways, that's very intuitive. In other ways, it's not. It's a paradox, in a way, for me at least, but reads quite simply. So before the change happened, there wasn't a user in the database, or there wasn't this user in the database. And now, after this trigger has happened, there is a user in the database. So now what we can do is we can go into our workflow actions and create a new thing. And here we'll create the notification preferences. And there isn't actually any fields here that we want to set. We could set here the user itself. I've run into some issues where just relying on the created by field for this, the created by field isn't set correctly to this user. And that is due to some way that Bubble is handling this in the back end that we don't have control over. If we want to have a relationship between the notification preference object and the user directly, then good idea to create our own field which we can call user, and we can set that to user now. And then to complete this relationship, we want to make sure that we're saving on the user that notification preference object that we just created. So we're going to have another action where we're going to go make changes to a thing. The thing that we're going to change is the now newly existed user. And we can set that notification preferences field to the result of step 1, i.e. that notification preferences object that we just created. And we don't need to set, again, we don't need to set the value for these guys, those notification event types, because we're saying by default, they're going to be set to yes. Okay, so no need for us to do anything else there. Okay, so let's quickly test this out. Create a new user, look into my database, and I might need to refresh the page here. There we are. And then under notification preferences, we have the new notification preference that was created. Now we've got this object set up correctly. What we need to do is be able to amend these fields based on the preferences that we set here. Let's make this one our new task created. And this, by the way, this is a settings page that you can, and a notifications group that you can pull in from the Basis extension. So this one is under forms, then you have settings list. Okay, so you can copy that and then paste it onto the page. The settings page by default has this group. So I'm going to change this one to new task assigned to me. We could add some supporting details. I'm not going to because it's not really relevant, is it? And these checkboxes, we want to make sure that we're naming them. So this one is checkbox new task, and this one is checkbox new assignment. And the reason for that is because these checkboxes have a custom state on them by default. Right? You can use the default custom state, you can use a toggle, you can use anything that just outputs some yes, no value, right? So when it's checked, this is going to be equal to yes in our case. And then we want to add a workflow to this save button, right? And that, as you might guess, is going to be making changes to that user preferences object. So now we can go current users, notification preferences, and I'm going to click add all fields to make this faster. The new assignment, that's going to be equal to one of those checkboxes that we just created. So checkbox, new assignment, and then we'll look for that custom state is checked. We don't have to say is yes, we can, okay, we can, but we could also just leave it as is checked, that is equivalent. And then checkbox, new tasks is checked. And then for good measure, I want to give a notification to the user to put up a little alert. So I'm going to use a plugin for that, which is actually called the Toast Notifications by Minimum Studio. And all we have to do is we have to place this notifier element somewhere on the page. Now, my preferred way of doing this is to put something like this inside of a floating group or a pop-up. So I've just put it inside of a normal group. I'm actually going to replace it with a floating group. We can call this something like assets and set it to be beneath the page. Set it to be 0% opacity so we know it will never be seen, but everything within it will be loaded with the page. We'll make this top center. And then I can just say notify a notifier, and we'll say email preferences updated. And then let's see if I go to my settings page here, you'll notice that these checkboxes actually aren't ticked already, even though they should be, because we know that the default values that we said were for them to be ticked. Let me make that change as well. In this case, because the yes, no is stored as a custom state, okay, we can't set custom states using dynamic data within elements. We'll have to do it on page load. We'll say when page is loaded. There's lots of different ways of doing this. When page is loaded, we're going to set the state. We'll set that to be equal to the current user's notification preferences new assignment value, right? And then we'll do exactly the same thing for the other checkbox new task. You can see here how the conversation that we're having at the beginning of this video, and we talked about What if we had a list of preferences that we stored, and then every time we had a new preference, all we had to do was basically create a new option set or something equivalent. That works in this scenario too, because we wouldn't have to set kind of two separate events here. We could just have one action that would add or remove one or more preferences from a notification object, and it would handle all this logic internally, so to speak. But this is a very kind of simple, quick and dirty way of setting it up that at least demonstrates the basic premise here. And it looks like that's not working, so I'm just going to go step by step here and see what's happening. So the page is loaded. The value of this object is empty. This is a very common bug that we might run across. It's hidden because of privacy rules. It's hidden because of privacy rules. And in this particular case, we're going to say when the notification preferences user is the current user, then all those privacy rules are exposed. And so now on page load, we should see those two guys become ticked, which is great. And then if we remove one of them, let's say hit save, email preferences updated, we can test if that worked by reloading the page. And when we do, only this guy should be ticked, and he is. Great. Okay, so that's basically now the data infrastructure that we need to get this working. Let's finish this off now. Let's get the end-to-end kind of feature working. We've got two parts remaining. We've got to first set up the trigger from our application that when a new task is going to be created, we're going to basically check what notifications the user has subscribed to, and then we're going to possibly, based on the result of that check, send an email to a user, fire that trigger, and then we basically need to have some way of actually sending that email. And for that, we're going to use Loops. Now, Loops, if you don't know, a really great email service provider. I've got a video about how to set it up, which I'll link to somewhere around here. So that's what we're going to set up today. I'm already logged into my Loops account. And once you do this, again, follow that video that I linked to if you need some help setting up your Loops account. I'm going to set up here a new transactional email template. Okay. Again, transactional emails that are sent as part of kind of the normal service of your application. And I'm going to set up a template for each of these notification types. New task created. And we could add in things like dynamic variables here, like the user's name. I'm just going to keep it a little simple right now and say something like, a new task was created, right? And we could have a button here, a button that says go to task, or rather, probably more appropriate would be open task. And we could add in a dynamic variable here as well, right? That would link to not task URL ask. That was definitely not intended. A new task was created. Thanks. And then you could say your company name. New task was created for the subject. Right, we'll hit next. We're going to make note of this transaction ID and our data variables. So what I've already got is an API call to Loops, which I set up in that other video. So again, watch that if you need help setting up the initial integration with the API here. I'm just going to duplicate this call that I already have. And this is going to be our send task notification. So the transaction ID that we get here, right? That's important. So we're going to paste that in. That's going to tell Loops what template we want them to use when they're sending out this email. And then the variables, the data variables, we've just got one task URL. So I'm going to remove button URL here. And I'm going to remove that comma, because the commas are just used to separate lines, separate attributes in JSON. And this is the only attribute here inside of this data variables object. And this is called task URL. So I might rename this as well as to task URL in Bubbles dynamic data section. And you want to fill this in dynamically, but for now, I'm just going to add in some static text to initialize with. And I'm getting an error because I forgot to publish our template. So I'm going to go ahead and click publish here within Loops. And now if I try to initialize this, it should work. Beautiful. Another one of these, exactly the same, except that it's going to be for the send task assignment. I should say send task notification email. Yeah, just to be really descriptive, all right? And in loops, this is going to be quite easy because I'm just going to duplicate that template that I already created. So new task assignment we could call, and we just change the text a little bit. You were assigned to a new task, right? Beautiful. We'll grab the transaction ID. We'll remember to hit publish while we're here. The payload should be exactly the same because we actually haven't changed anything. So the only thing that we need to swap out is the transaction ID, and then we'll reinitialize this just to make sure, and it works. These are both set up as actions, which means that we'll have access to them in workflows. So what I've got here on my tasks page, this is basically a template that I've already set up using the form, one of the form inputs from Basis UI. This is not necessarily exactly how you would set it up, but I've got a drop down here where I'm going to say, oh, it was assigned from a particular user. It's assigned to another user, just so that I can test this out, right? This assigned from might actually be something that we want to populate the email with, right? This, hey, Tracy assigned you a task. And you can do that simply enough by adding in some data variables. In fact, let's do it. Let's do it just so that you see start to finish how this works. So you were assigned to a new task by, and then we can add in a data variable here. Task assigner, could call it. And then we're going to have we don't see the new payload because we actually have to republish here. A bit of a confusing UX loops if you're watching this. And then we're going to show the payload again. We see we've got task assigner. So let's pop that in. Let's pop that into our send task notification email. API call. So again, I'm going to add that comma back because we need to separate this attribute from this new attribute that we're just going to add back in. And this is going to be the value, the name value for this attribute is going to be task assigner, and we can just call it the task assigner, assigner's name, something like that. And give it something to work with while we reinitialize. And looks like our JSON is invalid. That's because we've got comma at the end of this line, which we don't need because the comma is used, again, to separate lines. And this is the last line within this data variables object. Nothing to separate it. And that was successful. So what that means now is that in our actions, we should have, and we do, options for selecting those API calls that we just made. So send task assignment email will now give me those fields that I can fill dynamically. So what we could do is we could add those calls right here and add our condition down here to decide whether or not we're actually going to send that email. So we could have loops send task notification email. We could have both of these guys here and fill up these dynamic data, have an only when condition, which this is to wrap it all up, the secret source that would say something like only when the current user's notification preferences, new task, new assignment rather, right, is yes. That's how we would send this one. And then conversely, we would send the new task created as yes. So we could do it like this. That would work perfectly fine. However, my preference, again, talking about decoupling, would be to move this to the backend. Okay, we don't need to do these checks in real time. That's something that our server at the backend can handle for us. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to just cut this out, cut it out completely, come down to backend workflows, and we're going to add a new trigger, new database trigger event, which we'll call new task. And it's going to be, of course, a type task. And we're going to say, look, when the task before the change is empty and the task now is not empty. The same way that we did for the user earlier when we set up that notification preferences object, the task now, this phrase, checking the task before is empty and the task now is not empty, is Bubble's way of saying a new task was created. Okay, and now I'm just going to go ahead and paste that action from before. And Since we are tying this to a task, this is watching for changes to the tasks database or the tasks table. Let's go back to our tasks section here and just check what we're saving here on the task when it's created, right? We've got an assignee, which for demonstration purposes, I'm assigning to this drop-down. We've got a body, we've got the user who's creating it. So that's basically the assigner value, and then a title for that task. So really, assignee and creator user, those are the relevant pieces for us. So we'll be able to extract them from the task within this backend workflow, right? Because we're looking out for a task. So we should be able to here, if I clear this out, right? We're not checking for the current user in this example, right? We need to make sure we're checking for the right user. So the task now's assignee, right? The user who was assigned this task. We're going to check whether their notification preferences assignment value is yes. And in that case, we're going to send this, okay? And then in the equivalent way, we're going to send that new task was created. And we're going to do that when, again, we're going to look at task now assignee. So I'm just going to copy in this expression. Task now assignee's notification preferences. Only now the field, the information that we're checking is not the new assignment field, it's the new task created field. All right. And again, we could fill this in as task now assignee's email for the recipient. Copy that and paste that in here as well. And then the one who assigned this would be task now creator user's full name, right? The task URL I'm not going to worry about for now. If we had a page in our application where we were storing tasks, we had some logic that meant that when the user visited that page with the task ID, for example, in the URL, then it would show a pop-up with that task, right? We could do that kind of stuff. But this is just for demonstration purposes, so I'm not going to bother. And the nice thing about doing things like this, by the way, in a backend workflow, in a database trigger, is that we don't have to worry about privacy rules. So we don't have to worry about, would the current user actually have access to the task assigner's full name? We don't have to worry about that. All we have to worry about is that information available on the front end, okay? And we don't have a database structure that's worrying about teams and all that sort of thing, but that's the sort of thing that you would need to keep in mind here, where you actually are able to view the drop-down assignee and assigned from value. So in our case, privacy rules for the user, right? This is not how you would actually want to set up your production application for the record, but just for demonstration purposes so that this can work, right? This user object is basically visible to everybody. Same thing for a task. And just before we actually test this, one thing that I like to do here, anytime we're doing things on the back end for troubleshooting, I want to make a note of basically make a log recording the values in case things don't work. So I usually have a log data type like this with just a couple of fields in it, text, description, okay? And all I want to do when on this backend workflow here is I just want to create that log, and we'll use arbitrary text here to give it a name like new task created, because we might have logs created for in different contexts, right? And then the fields that I want to save, again, I'm going to wrap this in arbitrary text, which just lets us write things in a more flexible manner. So I just want to spit out a few of these fields like task assignee, task assigner, and then the preferences. So the preference new task and the preference new assignment. Okay. And then I'll just add the values here. Okay. So now that's all set up, let's go and actually test this out. Let's add an example task name, a very cliched one. We'll assign it to, I want to make sure I actually assign it to, I've got a few dummy users in the database and only one of them we created with our notification preferences logic set up. So we've got to make sure we assign it to Matt, and then we can assign it from basically anyone. Make sure to edit and post ASAP. Alexis is a real tyrant. That was in theory created, that task. So if I have a look under tasks, we've got a new task. Usually with these sorts of things, when I'm setting up a new backend workflow or database trigger, I want to check the logs, and it looks like we've got what we need here, right? New task email should not have been sent. New assignment email should have been sent. And if I check my emails, I do in fact only have one task. A new task was created is the subject line. So it looks like I forgot to change that. Yeah, it looks like I forgot to change that in loops. This should say a new task was assigned to you, but otherwise we know it's the same one. It's the right email because of the body. And even though this wasn't fed with anything dynamic, if I click the button, I would open the URL for that task. Okay, so that is user notification preferences in a nutshell. That same architecture basically works whether you're going to be sending emails or some kind of in-app notification or SMS messages, push notifications if you're building a mobile app, right? It is a way of handling all of those permissions within your Bubble application logic. So whatever external system, if any, that you're using to actually send those notifications, all they care about is whether or not they receive the trigger to send that notification, right? And that logic to handle the conditions under which when those triggers should be sent is all happening within your Bubble application. Now, what we've built here is obviously quite a simple setup, just a couple of notification preferences. But again, if you are going to be building an application where you think you're going to have lots of different types of things that you're going to want to notify your users about, then I would think about using this kind of data architecture here that we talked about in the beginning, where you actually have a list of different notification types that you are storing on your notification preferences data type, and then you basically add or remove notification types to that list, to this list of notifications, depending on what your users have actually opted into. So I hope that's useful. Any questions, leave them in the comments. Please subscribe, and happy bubbling.